Hello, happy people. Hopefully happy people anyway. So for those of you that are joining live, welcome. For those of you that are watching in the future / past, I guess, depending on how you look at it, welcome back. So we're going to spend the next hour editing in that program, Capture One, which is a raw processing piece of software. So those of you that have been on here for a long time, like Jeff and JD and who's on, where's Alan? Alan's missing. Alan from Australia is missing. Maybe. We'll see. But Paula's on, Ron's on, Jerry's on, loads of people are on. So welcome back. So those of you that know the drill, we're going to edit your photos as you have sent them in over the last week or so. Try and fix any problems that you've got in this raw editing package. For those of you that have not been here before, please make this as interactive as you like. So if I do something that doesn't make sense, ask a question. I'll see it in the comments or the live chat about sort of 3 or 4 seconds later. So there's a bit of a lag, but hopefully we'll try and fix anything as we go along the way, rather than you putting in loads of questions later on and leaving with them unanswered. So we're going to go into version 22. So version 22 of Capture One is the latest release. If you do not have version 22, so you're on either version 21, 20, there was a bit of a gap, so 12, 11, 10, 9 or whatever, then go into capture1.com. You can click on your little account thing in the top right and you can find out what the options are for upgrading. If you're on a subscription, that means you pay monthly. You always have access to the latest version. If you've bought your license outright, so you have a perpetual one, then you have the option to upgrade as and when you choose. That's up to you. Most of the stuff that we do today, you'll be able to follow along with version 20 or 21. There might be a couple of bits that are missing. But if you haven't touched Capture One before, go on to capture1.com, download the free trial. It works for 30 days. There's no limits, no stupid watermarking stuff, or you can't save anything, which I see in some software. So have a play with it, see how you go, and then hopefully, if you like it, then send us your images in a couple of weeks' time, and we'll have a play with them too. So let's get into Capture One itself. The current version being 15.1.2. But before we actually load up the desktop version, I'm going to talk very briefly about this stuff. So I was over with the guys in Copenhagen this week. They are doing some very cool stuff, not just on iPad, but also to push the desktop forward, and lots of stuff around the peripheral for that. So Capture One for iPad is coming, it's on its way. There's also going to be an iPhone version that Raphael announced a couple of months ago, I think. The functionality may be slightly different between the two. Not sure entirely what's going to be in which, but Capture One for iPad is currently now going out for beta testing, or beta testing, depending on where you live. The program to sign up is now full. So they announced it I think it was a couple of days ago. And I think within hours, they've got their full subscription of people that are able to try it. But they've now announced that the target for the full version, the live production version, will be summer. So they did say early this year. I guess some people are going to see it early this year. And certainly there are sort of previews that will come out and feature sort of mentions and updates that will be broadcast. But it does mean that the iPad version is inbound. The functionality, from what we can make out, is going to be non-tethered to start with, but tethering is in the works. And the options of what you've got for editing and whatever are basically going to use the power of the M1 chip. So I know there's a lot of questions that people have asked over the last couple of days. It will only work on an M1 iPad, and tethering will only work obviously with a USB-C connection in the bottom. So for those of you that are on an older iPad, so if you've got a Lightning port or an A1 or A15, A12, whatever chip you're on, you are not going to be able to use Capture One for iPad when it's released. That's not they haven't done a bad thing. It's funny, it's like, oh, how dare you only write software for current hardware. That's how it works. And actually, one of the things that's a challenge with iPads is the M1 is so powerful that they can throw a lot more features into it that wouldn't be as good and easy to use on a slower chipset. So in order to give people the best experience, it needs good hardware, and that's where the M1 limit is going to come from. So you've got the iPad Pro with M1 that was launched last summer, I think, from memory. which has, the big one has the XDR display, all great stuff. And then this week's announcement from Apple was the iPad Air, now with M1. So either of those iPads, you'll be fine for Capture One on iPad, and obviously anything moving forward on the M processors. So great. So to Paula, well, that's a new iPad for me. Sorry, it's not my call, but actually it does make sense. They want you to have a good user experience, and the arguments to say, oh, you should support everything previous, 10-year-old hardware and whatever, that's fine. But the only thing that's going to happen to the people running the 10-year-old hardware is they complain about the user experience. So you're better off in some ways focusing on the right kit, I guess, from the outset. So yeah, to JD's point, I've got a 2 terabyte iPad Pro. So interesting one for those that don't know. The iPad Pro, so the iPad Air has 8 gig of RAM. The iPad Pro also has 8 gig of RAM, except for the 1 terabyte and 2 terabyte options. So if you're looking for an iPad with a bit more punch, then those two options have 16 gig of RAM rather than the standard 8. So yeah, all the iPads are going to be more than capable of running, all the iPad M1s are more than capable of running Capture One when it comes out. But the top 2 tier iPads, the iPad Pro, will have a little bit more beef in behind them. So there we go. That was our little quick roundup. Also, next week, hopefully people will start receiving their Mac Studios if they've been buying them. So that could be fun. We'll have a look at how quickly they behave. So let's have a little look at Capture One for desktop. Sorry to be boring. We're going to go back to a desktop application, but let's be honest, the iPad app is designed to be part of a wider workflow. Some people may choose just to use the tablet version of it. I'm pretty sure most people are going to use the functionality of being able to sync between that whole sort of ecosystem. So Capture One Live, Capture One for iPad, and the fact that that'll all sit together is what people are looking for. So I can do certain stuff on the road, and then the bulk of my editing, the heavy lifting editing, probably back on a desktop screen, just like that one. So this is Jeff's shot. There are a few black and white conversions that Jeff sent in, but I'm going to pick on this one. I say pick on this one, but it's an edit that's been done with a conversion. So in Capture One, there are a few ways of actually doing a black and white conversion. One, we can go into styles. So we can actually pick up a style. There are black and white styles that we can use, and we can apply a style. Let's just create a new variant. So an original color one. And if we choose these styles, let's just put my before and after off, then we've got different ways of converting that image with one click into black and white. Great. One with film grain, ones with heavier contrast, lighter, more subtle. And whenever you're applying a style, what I would suggest people do is, you can't actually do it on the black and white. Normally, I'd suggest you do it as an apply to new layer. The reason being, we can always then change the opacity of the style, so we can come back to a different amount of that style being applied. With a black and white conversion or anything with film grain and certain other functions, you can only apply the style to the background, so it's a global change. Now, that's I guess option one. Option two, we could go into our normal sort of exposure tab or color tab for that matter, and I could put saturation down to -100. Now, that's a pretty basic black and white conversion. That's not doing really much other than just taking all the color out. So it's taking any color we did have and switching it to luminosity rather than the RGB value. So as you see, as we pull the saturation back out, we can see the different values. So the blues, there's obviously quite a lot in the highlights here. That's the sky, pretty much. The reds, we've got some more red down here than blue. That's probably some of these shadows in here, which is slightly brown. So all of that stuff, it is then compressed down to just the brightness values, and that's what the saturation is going to do. And then we get one line of the histogram. That single line tells us it's a monochromatic image, and there's our black and white conversion. Very simple. I've just seen a question somewhere. Where are we? Sorry, Chili. Is there a separate cost for the iPad version if you already have the desktop version of Capture One? So the wording at the moment that's been out there is this a subscription service. So that would suggest to me that there is a separate cost. I'm not sure what the rate is going to be. I don't know what that means for people that already own versus people that are coming at it fresh. But I would imagine there is going to be some sort of charge for it that's going to be confirmed at some point. Now, if you think about why, some of this is around the way that that software behaves. So effectively, the ecosystem, if you look at capture1.com, a few days ago, they put a bit of our vision out there. And that whole ecosystem for all of these different components relies on cloud and it relies on storage. And part of this is around how they shift your files around. So I'm going to guess there's some cost to doing that. So that's possibly why it comes. And I don't know. So I'm going to be honest, I don't know. But I would imagine if they go down the road of offering the Capture One for iPad product independently of Capture One for desktop, which some users may want, how do you do that if you don't have a sort of different option for pricing, I guess, for the two different products? That said, I don't know exactly what they're going to do. I don't know any price limits or ranges or anything like that, but I would imagine and I would expect that there will be some sort of cost associated with it. Oh, actually, yeah, so I don't do Capture One subscription. I purchased the license. So from what I've seen publicly, it's a subscription that they're looking at for it. So I don't believe it'll be a case of you buy it outright. Yeah. Jim, I have trouble really seeing an image on 27-inch screen, so a 10 or 13 inch just doesn't work for me. I keep getting nose marks on a small screen. I've done that. Yeah. So it depends on how you're going to use it. So if you're using it to do all your editing, which, as I say, some people may want it as a standalone application. If you're going to use it for all your editing, then maybe you want a bigger option or something like that. But the biggest iPad they have is 12.9 inch. If you're going to use it for culling, for I would use it on the road probably for selects. So if I've got 10 different shots, you can see pretty quickly which ones I need to pay attention to and which ones I don't. Which means when I get back to a proper screen, let's call it, or a big screen, some of my workload's already done because I could have done that sort of on the road, so to speak. But yeah, it depends on your use case. There we go. Actually, well, if they only do subscription only, I won't be getting it. Okay, then you won't be getting it. Choices, life's about them. So yeah, it's going to be people's decisions. You can choose whether or not you want that feature or not. There is the other flip side to look at it. And as I say, I'm not saying this because it's going to happen. I'm saying it because I'm exploring in my head the other options. Imagine they bundle it in to the desktop cost. So next year, everyone's desktop cost goes up because software development gets paid for somehow. People have salaries and businesses have costs. So if they bundle it into the desktop application, then every person who doesn't have an iPad is then going to complain. So you're kind of in a place where you're charging people that have or want a function for the function that they want and not charging others that don't. That seems reasonable to me, but yeah, okay. Right. So back to our black and white software. Our black and white conversion. So if we pull down saturation, you're going to get a very flat image for a start because it's not doing anything clever, but you've got access to all of the other sliders just as you did before. So we can lift up shadows, we can pull down black, we can increase clarity and so on. But it's very much a sledgehammer approach because all we've done is just taken away the color. So let's just reset all of this. And instead we'll go into what Capture One offers, which is the black and white conversion. So under your color tab, which is these three circles up here, at the bottom normally, but you can move these around obviously, you've got a black and white conversion and we can click on enable black and white. And this allows us to do things slightly differently because what it allows us to do is to control how Capture One translates different values of red, yellow, well, yeah, we've got it in front of us, red, yellow, green, cyan, blue, and magenta. That conversion allows us to control the luminosity of those channels independently. So if we go back to our image here, we've got a blue sky, and this is quite red and yellow in here. So in my black and white, if I want to darken the sky, but leave everything else as it was, Well, I can pull on cyan and I can pull on blue and we can pull this down. So I want to be careful that we don't push it too far, but that brings the blues down certainly. Now be careful in one way, because of course the blue of the sky is also the blue of the sea. So be aware of that. If we wanted to pull up the sea, well, we could actually pull up the blues and pull down the cyans, because the cyans are affecting the sky more than they are the sea. But we can play. So let's look at the earthy stuff along here. Well, those yellows and those reds we can pull down, so that then starts to differentiate this sort of, I guess, what is it, like a rock pool or something? I don't know. But we've got a huge amount of control in here as a result of using Capture One's own black and white conversion. And of course, you've got in here different presets. So if I go to the little three or the three lines or the hamburger, you've got loads of different presets. They go off the screen. You can't even see the rest of them. But just like with styles, we can apply those presets to the black and white conversion. So those are the different ways of doing black and white within Capture One. And of course, one thing to bear in mind, these sliders here are affected by your white balance. So if let's just clone this. So here's a fun one. Here's our standard shot. So effectively, Jeff's original standard shot has taken a daylight white balance, and we've just taken that black and white conversion, and we've just made a couple of changes with the sliders. Now let's go to the same shot, but change its white balance. So it's input white balance. So we're going to go warmer. Now with black and white turned off, you'll see we've got rid of the blue. We've got rid of some of the cyans and everything's gone very purpley and yellowy and red. Well, if you remember, we darkened all the yellows and reds. That cyan slider is having no effect anymore. So these are the same picture, the exact same black and white conversion, no difference, but this one has a colder white balance than this one. So this one's effect for the cyan and blue slider actually is an effect, whereas on this one, it has no effect whatsoever. This one is getting more altered and adjusted by the red and the yellow channels than this one. So whenever you do the black and white conversion, just bear in mind what your underlying white balance is before you start playing with those sliders. Get the white balance right so that in your head, when you think of the sky and you darken it, you're doing it with the blue and the cyan sliders, because the sky is blue and cyan rather than, in this case, purple and brown. Okay, so let's have a look at Jeff's actual edit. So here we are. And to be honest, Jeff, there's nothing wrong with this edit. The only thing that I struggle with a bit with it is what you want me to look at. Because if and actually the clue, I guess, is in this mask, this final mask, and you did put some question marks on it. So I guess it's a question as to whether or not you want it. But in your exposure tab, you've increased the middle part of this image by half a stop. That's fine, but effectively that's just a vignette. What we've actually done is just, whether you lighten the middle or darken the edges, it's the same effect. We've just vignetted the shot. But the problem is that I'm not sure this is our point of focus really, because you're lightening the sea, part of the rock pool, or oh, you've just said what it is somewhere. The salt pans, okay, in Gozo. In Malta, right. Oh, it's sea salt. Ah, cool. Okay. There we go. We learn something every day. So we've got part of the salt pans, part of this background rock, part of the sea, all illuminated more, so half a stop more of brightness. But there's no reason why this would be illuminated the same amount of this as this, but this wouldn't. And why is the sea brighter here where it's darker here? That it doesn't really make sense. So if I take this off, that's where the image started without that radial, and then I get kind of why you'd have added it. And the reason you've added it, I think, is because without that radial mask, or with the radial layer in there, it feels like there's not really much of a subject. But we can create one to an extent. So let's just look at our before. The subject was very clearly these sort of salt pan elements here, with this being a secondary subject, I guess. But I get it. When you go into black and white, you kind of lose it because this has become so bright. Well, in terms of that becoming bright, why don't we do one of two things? One is we could change how bright that is. So we could use our black and white conversion. We could put a mask on there, and you've already got a darkened mask on there, which has got a luma range added by the look of it, although there's some weird drawing that's gone on down here. I'm not sure about this mask, Jeff, to be honest. Let's go to grayscale mask. So I'm not sure exactly why we've got some of these squiggles that we do, but they're there. That's okay. But with that mask, let's just turn that off. We could darken down this thing in the distance as well. If I don't want to do it by using a mask, and I want to do it using the filters, well, we can of course use these filters down here on our background layer to make a couple of changes. So we can, let's just go to our before. So this out here is kind of yellowy red in terms of tone, and we can actually tell that if I move my mouse over here. Look at these values at the top. So in here we're at sort of 178 red, 160 green, so red and green together makes our yellow, 125 blue, so it's definitely towards the yellow and red areas. So if I go into here and then pull back our reds, well, yeah, we get a decent conversion there that actually drops some of this, but hasn't got enough of it. It's still too bright. And up here, look, we're pretty much at grey, 161, 156, 144 if I'm reading the numbers at the top of the screen. So none of these here are necessarily going to catch it. So maybe then we look at taking the highlights down. Let's take our highlight here. It's already at minus 100, but the whites aren't touched. So what if I bring the white down? We get a bit of a change, but it's affecting the sky even more. So I'm going to end up doing one of two things. I'm either going to end up masking that background to try and bring focus into the foreground, or we do a slightly smarter move of that radial that you had already and move it into a trail, so we've got a leading line up into that background. So let's have that a go. Let's give that a little go. So let's call it trail. So I don't need to touch this. This is already as bright as I want. And as I move my mouse up here, we can see on the histogram, it's right there up in the highlights. I don't want to push that anymore, but I need to bring some of these elements up to be brighter. So really, really softly, we're going to go to a low flow in this case. Really soft brush, so hardness down to 0. Make sure your auto mask is off. And what we're going to do is we're just going to paint. Turn my mask on. Down here. Now with flow, remember, every time we go over the same spot, we're building on the mask. So I'm going to turn this into grayscale in a minute so you can see. But you'll see some areas I'm going over a lot, some areas I'm going over less. Let's have a little look at where we are at. So we've got stronger mask down here, lighter mask as we go out into the distance, and then no mask up here. And with that layer, just that layer, I'm going to affect the shadows and bring them up. So look at this area here. That's all in shadow. So let's lift those. Let's lift off the blacks a touch. And then we can push brightness. Now, the reason I'm using brightness is you've got some areas in here that might already be pretty much pushed to near the limit of their highlights. By using brightness, we're squashing the histogram. We're getting it brighter, but we're not pushing those bright areas, the highlights and the very, very brightest parts off the end of the histogram. We're not pushing anything to be overexposed. So if we use brightness to pull this up, and I'm going to go over and above what I would normally do. So I'm going to go to maybe 20. Pull up our shadow quite a bit there. Okay, and now with our background, I'm going to pull down our exposure a touch and down our brightness a touch, just so I can see how that path's looking. Now this is too much, it was done intentionally, but now I can see that that path is actually kind of along the right trail, but I don't like this bit here. So let's just go into our eraser. So again, soft eraser. I can get away with a lower amount of opacity. And we're just gonna back this off a little bit down here. So down there, bit of this. And we can see basically what I'm doing is I'm just getting rid of those bits that are going to be too bright, too exposed, but leaving that trail that goes off into the distance. With that done, I'm now going to pull that brightness back a little bit. So maybe back to 10. And that gives me a sort of a lead in line. Now, if I don't like that line with this, I can pick a different one. We can still go in and, remove parts of that mask and that trail, but it means that at least we've got something. And again, I'm on the eraser at the moment. If I want to add bits into that mask, then let's just switch to our brush and we can add out into the distance. And remember, the mask isn't just increasing exposure, it's lifting shadows, it's lifting blacks, and it's lifting brightness. But if I go from there to there, well, we're now actually a bit too dark maybe, so I'm just going to go back to my background, and because we did it with brightness, not with exposure, there's no risk to losing our shadows or crushing them too much. But we go from here, which sort of has this radial thing in the middle, to something that actually leads us in the image out into the distance. Again, if this is too much, well, we just back it off a little bit. Jeff's just said, look at the mask and the lighting layer, maybe a bit too overdone. Let's just have a look. So if we turn that layer off, yeah, actually, maybe that distance, there's getting an effect from that. I'm okay with the foreground, though, Jeff, that you've already done in there, because at least that's lifting that foreground to bring us into the picture. But maybe up here, yep, on the lighten layer, let's just, again, our opacity nice and low, really soft layer. And I'm just going to back that away a little bit, just to back off that that increase out in the distance. And that's where I'd leave it. But at least then we've got some sort of lead in, I guess, up to that structure in the background. But that's probably where I'd be. Now, you've just asked a question, actually, which is a very good one here. What crop would you use? I struggle, and maybe this is just a weird mind thing, I struggle when I've got a line that's near the edge of a print that's not even or not aligned or not parallel or perpendicular or whatever, but it feels geometrically odd. And here we're going to have to do one of two things. Either you're going to have to fix the keystone, which is what we'll try in a second, or we're going to crop in from there, to be honest, because this bit down the bottom makes me a little bit awkward. We've got it touching down here, and then it goes away up here. We don't want to just rotate the image, because that rotation is going to knock out our horizon. So we're going to go to a horizontal keystone. And I'm going to lay this keystone out here on the horizon to lock it in place. So that horizon isn't going to change now, even with our keystone change. But what is going to change is this line here, and we're just going to follow the line of this sort of wall here, hit apply, and we see it starts to pull, it starts to straighten. Now what that means is we've got a level horizon, but at least this line now is straight along the base. I would personally go one further and crop that out, if I'm honest. So even with it being straight, I'm happier with this line now, because it's now at least parallel to the edge of the frame. But if we were to go, let's say, I don't know whether I want to go 1x2 with you, to be honest. Maybe we go 16x9, which is a bit more forgiving. We can move up here, clear of this sort of wall, with enough detail out here. We've got to be, I'll show you something in a second. You've got to be careful here with that mask out there. But that would be the crop that I use. Now, here, we've got a bit of a problem if you look. So this is where a mask has been drawn, but unfortunately it stops where the original crop was. So let's just see where that mask is. Is it the darkened mask? Yeah. So all we're going to do, in this case, we're kind of lucky. We can add a bit of the mask back in, but it's one of the reasons why I say to people quite often, actually very often, do your crop last. Just turn the brush instead of a razor. But the reason for doing the crop last isn't because we're undecided. It's actually because you can make these decisions about where that crop's going to be later on. So where this wasn't going out to the edges, you ended up with that weird sort of bump. Now, okay, we fixed it in that sense. But imagine you've done all those edits just inside a smaller crop, and then you decide, actually, I want it to be a wider crop. How are you going to fix that at the edges? So think about that when you're doing stuff. But to me, that's where I would leave that shot. So here's our original. That to me is a slightly more powerful view of the same, it's the same place, just a slightly different approach. What I'm tempted, just looking at that now, almost on the smaller screen as well, I'm just going to knock back some, not all, some of this foreground brightening here, just in there. But that's me. That's where I would go. So there was our original. There's our final version. That's kind of where I'd leave it. So just back to your questions. I've seen quite a lot of chat on there, so let's just make sure you've covered it. Bobby, is there a way to get those color sliders to work for colored images instead of black and white, like in Lightroom? So do you mean can you alter the brightness and intensity and saturation of individual colors? Yes, you can, but not in that tool. So if I go back to our raw, let's just reset that white balance. In the color editor, that's what the color editor is for. So if I go into our basic color editor, I can go to blues and I can pull down their lightness. I can pull down their saturation if I want to. I can shift their hue. We can make them more purple, more cyan. If I go to our cyans, I can shift them to be more blue. We can make them more saturated, deeper color. So yes, it's just this slider gives you the ability to do it per color, but 3 controls per color. So what the color is, hue, how much of that color, saturation, and how bright the output's going to be, which is lightness. In black and white, you literally only have lightness, so you have the luminosity of that channel. So yes, and that's the basic version. The advanced version, exactly the same ability, but rather than having to worry about what Capture One has decided my colors are, I can choose that exact color there. And we can say actually for anything that's even a little bit left and right of that, and how smoothly we adopt the changes within this wedge. But again, it's changed the hue, changed the saturation, changed the brightness, same thing. So I think that was the question. But yeah. David, I've been doing some experimenting with adjusting the individual red, green, and blue curves after converting to black and white. Is there any advantage, disadvantage of doing that over the color sliders? No. So one thing to bear in mind for everyone to that extent is when you use the black and white tool. So let's just get David's thing off the screen. This one here, effectively, it is basically editing the color curves in the image. So as you slide, let's say the red slider left and right, well, it's basically going into the red channel here, and it's adjusting the red content to be brighter or darker. Yellow, it's adjusting both red and green and so on. So if you're comfortable doing it in a curve, you're going to get the same result or better because you've got a lot more control over it. So if I go into our black and white here, let's just clone that variant here. So in my red slide, well, in fact, let's go to the blue. So in our blue slider, we wanted to affect the sky. Well, the sky was in a pretty bright spot, somewhere maybe around here. So if I bring this up or down, what am I? Hold on a second. Have I just done something really stupid? I think I have. Because we can't change the curve once we've done a conversion into black and white. So if I turn off our enable black and white and then pull down our saturation, sorry, that's on that layer, and then pull down our saturation, now potentially do we get to a place where, no, because we're adjusting the output. No, I was going to go, so it is altering the curves in the background, David, is the answer, but it's not going to get you what you want out of this curve because this is the output translation curve. It's not translating what goes in to the image. So yeah, sorry, I sort of confused things there a bit, but yeah, no, is the short answer, because you need to be adjusting the input levels and curves, not the translation of that output effectively. So this is going to translate what comes out, whereas these sliders are taking what comes in from the raw and translating that into a single monotone image on the way out. So it's a slightly different thing. But yeah, I need to have a play with that, to be honest, as to what it's going to do differently if we get it right. So yeah, we'll come back to that one. So where else were we? Jeff would never have thought the keystone. Yeah, so just bear in mind, rotating something. So this is the original sort of here. Rotating something doesn't necessarily fix other issues as they come nearer or further away from the camera. You will end up with an issue with any time you're involving geometric shapes into an image. You're always going to end up just being careful. You have to be careful around the edges of an image if they look uncomfortable. And to me, the easiest way of getting rid of any risk is just to crop it out. But even with that, you still want this line here to be parallel, at least with the rest. And if you just done it through rotation, all that's going to happen is you rotate the whole image, so your horizon is straight, this isn't. Or let's say we rotated it so this was straight, well then the horizon wouldn't be. And that's what Keystone is for. Paul, you could always pre-crop with guides. Yep, I know a lot of people that do that. They'll place in some guides, so they've got a working area, like a safe area for a video edit, and then come back to it later where they can still do a load of cropping. Right, where are we? So, slightly off topic, but will auto horizon be fooled by the foreground? Possibly. Let's have a little go. Well, not auto horizon, but auto rotate. Let's go to our original raw, so it's off rotation angle. Let's go to our lens correction, rotation and flip. So we've got our auto function here. This was brought in 22. Let's click the button. It's kind of been fooled by everything, to be honest, Michael. So it's not quite got the horizon right. It's not quite got the salt pans right. I'm not sure what it has actually got straight. Yeah, auto rotate. Sometimes it, ironically, I think I said this when we first when they brought it out in the first place. Auto rotate, funnily enough, struggles with horizons from what I've seen. It's an odd thing. The more obvious we think it is to our eyes, for some reason it doesn't. Whereas I've seen really complicated city shots or really complicated stuff with organic mountains and hills that it's got spot on. But you know, where there is an obvious horizon, no, it kind of got it a little bit wrong. But there we go. Right. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So, unfortunately, I found it's fooled for no reason with quite simple seascapes. Yeah, I don't know why, but there is. It's almost like it's you know, there's always that person that's like too clever, and the simplest things it struggles with sometimes, or simplest things they struggle with. So anyway, on to Bob's shot. So the question from Bob is this overdone? And I guess my answer back is it depends what you wanted to achieve. If I compare it to the raw, let's just look at our raw here. It feels very different. I'm going to say that for sure. So this has got soft pastel tones. It's a bit bluer. It's a bit cooler. You know, we've got a few pinks and reds and oranges, but there's a lot of blue in here and a lot of faded grey. The edit, we've gone sort of, you know, real deep, thick orange, quite heavy mud colour here, which actually then brings in some greens. And green water versus an orange sky doesn't really quite sit that well. I'm concerned it's not as accurate to the original picture as it could be. But you know, there's the right elements in here. So you know, you've got a sky element, which is obviously bringing in quite a bit of highlight recovery in there. Saturation's boosted quite a bit. You know, 26 is quite a lot of saturation boost. You've got a brightness boost in the background, so you've got already a highlight recovery on the whole picture. Blacks have been pushed all the way up. Sky is then recovering highlights even more, so another 88. Deep Sky, which is the brush from Capture One, is then recovering highlights even more, minus 50. The beach is then lifted a little bit. The sandbar, that particular sandbar is in shadow then, so that's been pulled up a little bit. And then the water, we've got a bit of a drop. So I've talked about this in previous sessions where you've got to be careful that you're not playing seesaw. So, you know, we're lifting some shadows, and then that means that one object then gets a little bit too bright. So we then darken the shadows. And then, especially on highlight recovery, you know, we push the exposure to be brighter, and then we recover the highlights. Well, that then makes other things darker. So we pull brightness up, and then we recover the highlights. And then you can end up getting out of control really quickly with a lot of different tools, where one would have done the job just to a more subtle amount. So if I were looking at this from my fresh perspective, as it were, let's just clone this so we've got a new baseline. I'm just going to remove, what's that heel layer? There's a couple of blips down there, so that's fine. So our background layer, so Bob's already done this on the background. That black area here, well, the interesting bit is the black here isn't naturally in the picture. So the fact that we've had to rescue blacks doesn't really, or sorry, rescue blacks, but the brightness here we've had to pull up and the highlights pull down doesn't really make much sense because the original here didn't have all of those elements. So there's something going on somewhere. I'm not sure exactly where, but there is something going on. Maybe it's in a curve or in some levels. Ah, there we go. There's a curve in there. And there's some levels in there. Okay. So a lot of this recovery, so when we're in here and then we're having to lift the shadows and pull down the highlights, well, part of that reason is because this base set of levels here is darkening everything, brightening the highlights even more. And then we've got another contrast curve put in here as an S-curve, which is making it really high contrast. And then you're using all the other tools to back away the highlights, back away the shadows. So everything that you've done in here, we're then undoing with the other tools that's gone too far. The other thing to bear in mind on the levels, I'm just going to bring up a floating tool of levels so you can see. Be really careful with what this actually means in levels. So, why can't we grab there? Okay. So, with our levels tool, look at this line here. You see this point here is our black point. In other words, anything left of this particular indicator is going to be at 0. That's exactly what this line means. 34 becomes 0. But here's the problem. There's stuff in this image which is lower than 34. So in other words, there's stuff in this image that's now beyond black. It's beyond any visible detail of red, green, or blue data. It's now underexposed. Likewise, in the highlights, we've got some that are over. And this mid-tone shift to shift the whole feel of the image to be darker or lighter, depending on where that midpoint goes. So, to me, this is where I'd start. I'd pull this back. I'd pull that away so that we don't have those crushed shadows. We don't have the overblown highlights. I'd also then, let's just remove that tool. I'd also then back away this curve a little bit because that curve's making everything brighter. And then we're going to use highlights to try and recover it. Well, that doesn't make sense. So leave that where it is. If you want a little bit of darkness in here, you've already done it through levels. So if I undo, that's where we were as the raw. That's what the levels is doing. Why are we darkening it again in curves? It doesn't quite add up in my head. So I'd soften that down. We've got a heck of a shift between the right-hand side with all this color, the left-hand side, which is quite a lot brighter and lighter. So I think probably the only thing I would be tempted to do on here, we've got some highlight recovery in there already, is to put in another gradient across that corner. Clarity and structure, pulling down structure is going to lose some detail, but it's also going to make things overly soft. Clarity at 53 on a natural scene is possibly a bit too high, so I'd maybe pull it into sort of 30. We've got to be careful as to where our horizon is on this shot because it's, where are we? The problem is we've got the sea coming off at an angle, so it makes things a little bit awkward, but we're kind of straight, so okay. But let's add that new layer. So we'll go top left gradient. And I'm going to put a square gradient in. Really soft, so the bigger the gradient, the softer it's going to be. And with this area up here, I'm going to pull down the highlights. And we might even pull down a little bit of brightness too. And that's just evening up the scene. Now on the overall scene, we could go back to background, but actually I'm going to do it as a new filled layer. Actually, we'll leave it over the top. The overall scene, I'm going to boost that saturation a touch. Not a huge amount, just a touch. And we might want to darken this area here so we're keeping the focus towards this middle part. So we've got a top left grad already. Well, we can add a bottom right grad. And that bottom right grad, we're just going to darken down a little bit, but I'm actually going to draw the gradient in first. That would be a good idea. So on here, just into there. I don't want to affect this guy up here or this here, so it needs to be gone by the time it gets there. And then we pull it down maybe a tiny amount, a third of a stop. Not a lot. Overall, the rest of it up here, well, we can put these are global changes, but we can put a sky grad on. So this will be a flat graduated filter. that's going to come straight down here. In fact, we're going to have it slightly off center into there. And with that filter, we're going to, recover some highlights. But we're also going to boost a touch of clarity just in the sky. I don't want to affect this stuff down here. It'll overdo it. We could pull down our brightness a little bit, and we could pull up our saturation a touch. Now, you've now got effectively layers that affect the bottom right, that affect the top left, the sky and the bright parts overall, and a global change layer. And that global change layer is basically just there to make anything that we want to happen across the board. So that overall saturation change in this case, but we could of course do a shadow lift if we wanted to. But again, think about it. Why am I lifting the shadows here when I've just put a change in the levels to push the shadows down? That these two things don't really make much sense if you think about each step. One is undoing the other. So we're in a place of, I don't want that phrase, less is more. It's not less is more. Don't fall into that trap. But if I look at the original here, and if I reset all these layers, let me just go back to the raw on here, apart from our crop. I'm just going to reset everything apart from crop. So there's our out of camera. There's where we got to in the original edit. That's where I would leave it. And you'll see the difference between these two is quite stark. So is this overdone? Not necessarily. It depends what you want. So, in Bob's original edit, you're in a place where it can work like that if you meant it to be that harsh. But I would be tempted to go more granular, be more careful, especially when you look at things like, let's just go into this sand here. This is overdone here. Sand looks like that. It doesn't necessarily look quite like this sort of weird, sort of pointillized texture. And that's where you've got too much or too much clarity, and maybe something weird going on with the structure as well. But yeah, it's just be careful that you haven't overdone it when you're doing this stuff. It's always useful to go back each time. So always keep doing the before and after, before and after. If this is the tone you want, then great. If we don't want that tone, let's go back to our white balance quickly, on our global changes. And I could pull this down cooler. We could pull our tint a little bit there. Maybe that works. So there's our original. There's our edit. But then when you look at it like this, then that does feel overdone. Doesn't mean it is overdone. If that's what you wanted to print, it's fine. But I'd go from there to there. I wouldn't push it quite that far, to be honest. Okay, next up, Brian. This is a last-minute entry, as it were, for Brian's shot of the cloud. Now, Brian, you mentioned there's a cloud over the third mountain on the left. I'm not sure I see what one you're talking about, but there's an overall edit. So these are out in the Tetons, I think. But not sure which one we're going to pick on. What one do we like? Maybe the second one. Maybe that one. Okay. So you've already made some changes. You've got your adjustment layer in here. Now, this is why we do it on a sort of global layer, because I can back away the changes by changing the opacity. But all those changes are, effectively in this case, are some brightness, some exposure, stuff like that. And it's just around this area here. So what Brian was saying is there is a cloud over this mountain that was hugging it, but wasn't necessarily captured on camera. I've got to say, I don't see it as a cloud, if I'm being weird about it, because what I see is the sun is obviously setting down here. It's kind of, it's kind of hitting, we've got a bit of a ray out here, and then we've got this part. This is basically in light. I'm not sure a cloud is necessarily that shape, so I'm not sure what was there at the time. I don't want to presume what was there at the time, but that layer, it isn't doing much, because I don't think there's much there to do anything with. There's not really color or anything like that. So I wouldn't focus necessarily on just that bit. I'd look at the whole image and see what you can do. The first thing we're going to do is actually look at our base characteristics. So quite often we talk about the difference between linear response, auto, film standard, and so on as curves. So if we look in here, we've got different curves for Capture One. When Capture One loads in an image by default, it's going to apply the auto curve. The auto curve is film standard. You also have film high contrast. You also have extra shadow, and you've got one called linear response. Now, what these curves are doing is they are altering the input curve. So going back to earlier when I went a bit weird and confused, it's altering how this information gets into Capture One for you to then edit it from that point. So it actually changes the makeup and content of this curve. So if I create a new floating tool called curve, so you can see what's going on, keep it on the same tab. Let's go to our base characteristics tab and look at film standard. Fine. Film high contrast. Look at how the data's been changed. Extra shadow. So in other words, it's lifted the shadows. And then you've got linear response. Bang. And linear response is probably the one that makes the most difference when you choose it out of all the other ones. Because what it does is it removes the built-in almost S-curve or contrast curve that film standard, high contrast, and extra shadow build in. So what those ones do is they take the input values and they push up the highlights, push down the shadows, and you get a great boost of contrast. But here's the problem. Look at this area here. It's really overblown. And look at these areas here. They're really underexposed. So adding in contrast, adding in an S-curve is really pushing those things too far out of our range. We can, of course, fix that by effectively going into our HDR tool. Let's just go to our, in fact, we'll create a new filled layer. And I can pull back highlights. Great. I can pull up shadows. Great. I can pull down whites. I can pull up blacks. And we get a horrible look at the moment. And we've done it too far just on purpose. But you can see you can get all that data back. But it's trying to recover something that we've already made a decision to push too far. Just like in the previous one, what happens if we make a decision to not push it too far in the first place? So go for linear response. Now, linear response means that we've got recovery in the highlights, we've got recovery in the shadows. I can pull up, for instance, brightness, and it's not going to affect this too much. I can pull up my shadows. So in other words, the data starts closer together. Now I've got to add contrast. So linear response does everything to remove contrast that the auto or film standard curve actually does to add contrast. So if you have a really, really high contrast image, such as these, maybe it's worth starting with linear response. Now, one thing that concerns me in here is this little hotspot. And for sure, it's overexposed. And where it's exposed is in probably the red channel there. So we can see it. Look at the top numbers. So in this area here, we're at 255 on red. The green and the blue isn't too bad, but we're getting an exposure warning on there. So a couple of things we could try and do. Number one, we could just pull down our exposure. There we go. And we've got rid of that problem. Great. The second is we could go into our red channel and we could try and pull down our red at the top. The problem with doing that is we're going to shift the other colors because, of course, we're only pulling red. And this yellow here isn't made up of just red. It's made up of a little bit of green, a little bit of blue, and all that stuff. You can see that on the top. So instead of that, we can do it with Luma Curve, or we can do it with levels. So levels would mean we can actually go the reverse, and we could shift our output level to be lower than 255. So we're shifting this data, certainly the stuff at the top, this stuff up here. And normally with levels, what we do is we use it to make things brighter or make things darker. So we're shifting the input to be brighter or the input down the bottom to be darker. So from 219, it becomes 255. 23, it becomes 0. This shadow becomes black. This highlight becomes white. But you can use levels in the reverse way and say, actually, this bright part, this 255, becomes 230. Much better. And actually, we can do it in the shadows as well. We can lift the shadows using levels too. You could do it on an individual channel. So we could say just the reds, drop that down. But again, remember, this color isn't made up of just red. It's also green in there. You can see the green's at 255. So then I go to my green channel and let's pull that down. So we get that to 230. Now we've got a color shift. all towards the blue. So we now go to the blue channel and go there. And guess what? You end up in exactly the same place you would have been if you'd just gone on RGB and pulled down that output there. So we can do it through isolating highlights. We can do it through exposure. We can do it through HDR. In this case, we're going to do it by pulling down that exposure a touch, so half a stop roughly, pulling down our highlights a little bit, and then going back into that mindset of brightness brightens stuff rather than pushes data off the end of the histogram. So with our brightness up here, we could pull it even further if we wanted to. 30 on brightness, great. And we can pull up our shadows a touch. And if we wanted to, the very, very darkest parts, we can pull up those blacks. So I'm just going to clone this variant and delete that layer so we've got something to compare. Cool. I think we're on a hill here, so even though my temptation is to try and fix that horizon, I don't think this is the horizon, which is a problem. What I could do, your choice, but I could play with Keystone, which would keep that horizon, or so-called horizon level, without actually rotating the image, but that's your call. You can decide what you want to do with that. But the rest of the shot here now it's just around getting rid of some of that flattening that the linear response curve did. So we did some of the flattening intentionally. We did it through a linear response curve. Now we're going to try and put some contrast in. Just one question I'm going to cover. So Francois, yeah, you're right. There is another method of doing the recovery. So let's just go to clone that. Let's just reset what we did here and here and here and here. So the other place to do it would be in our color balance tool on the highlights. We could just darken down highlights, but just bear in mind you're going to get a color shift as well. So yes, in certain situations you can get it there, but it's not just the highlight we want to affect, it's the stuff that's coming off the sides. And as you see, look, here is a highlight for sure, but as I come off the cloud, you see that orange bar on the left starting to move away from the highlight. It's not all just in this highlight section. We need to be a bit smoother than that, and that's where levels or curves allows that smoothing out. Okay, so let's go back to our one here. So again, we've flattened everything. We've got a little bit less contrast in here. What we can do to add some contrast, number one, we can use the contrast slider within Capture One. So we've now rescued some of the highlights, we've got some contrast built back in, and we can pull up a little bit of saturation. That sort of works. Now to push some interest into those mountains, well, let's maybe put in a quick radial. So we go top radial. This is global. So our top radial, we're going to draw really, really, again, soft, the softer the better. Little radial mask in there, pull that exposure down. We might want to pull up a bit of saturation. As we pull down exposure, we can lose some of the color. But that allows us then to go back to our global layer and potentially pull up brightness a touch more. I can then put a new layer in, which would be bottom radial. So even though I want to see the detail out here, I still want to lead into this shot. So let's just put another little mask up here. And with this one, we're just going to pull down that exposure again too. And we get to a pretty nice place, a pretty natural looking place. We've rescued this highlight in here. We've got, I'm not sure whether it is a cloud, Brian, but we'll see up here. But we've got all this color in the clouds and the sky up here that wasn't going to be there if we tried to do it from the original auto curve. So in here, this was our original shot. We've got overexposure, underexposure, and a relatively flat image. Here, by using linear response as our baseline, we've now got the ability to pull up our shadows, the ability to pull down our highlights, but we're starting from a place where this cloud isn't overbaked to start with. This is a much cleaner starting base than this one. Only one thing that sort of worries me a little bit is the snow in the mountains out here. There's a bit of a color cast on them. We could arguably, let's just create a new one called Magic Brush. You can guess what we're going to use. Magic Brush Mountains. So let's just draw a quick addition onto the mountains. Doing a pretty good job there. And what I might do just to do it quickly. Let's just take our saturation down a little bit. Maybe to there. We could do it with white balance, so we could, warm it up a touch. We could hit that tint a bit. Maybe that's a little bit better. There's a hot pixel in there by the look of it, so we're going to go into our detail tab, back to our background layer, and we can get rid of our single pixel, like that. And then we're pretty good. So we've got a layer for the mountain, which is cooling down or getting rid of the coolness of that mountain. We've got a bottom, it's not a radial mask, it's graduated mask, sorry, wrong word. But a bottom grad that's darkening at the edge. We've got a top grad that's darkening at the top. But that global adjustment is all done based on starting from a linear response curve, not from the auto curve. If we'd done all of that stuff, but we'd started from the auto curve, yeah, we'd have overbaked it. So that's where I'd go. Cool. So that's it for this week, I think. Bobby, to your point here, for my needs, Auto does a pretty good job. Honestly, in 70-80% of cases, Auto does just fine. And you might have to recover little bits. But when you've got a very, very high contrast image such as this one, try linear response. It can sometimes get you a better place to start with. So, Brian's Mountains, Bob's Beach, just back it away a little bit. Don't push it too far. And Jeff's Salt Pans, going off into the distance with some black and white conversions. Done. So we will be back next week, next Thursday. We've got some cool stuff to show you next Thursday, hopefully. But in the meantime, send in your images. We'll try and get through as many as we can each time. But send in your shots, poryforlive.wetransfer.com, which is on that thing there. Please include your name, otherwise we can't include you, but also include the raw file if you've got it and any edits that you've made so you can package it up as an EIP. Send them through. David, I'm going to have a little bit of a play with black and white conversion and then playing with curves afterwards. We'll try and pick that up next week to see if there is maybe a bit of a tweak that we can do, make things even better. But between now and then, look after yourselves and we'll catch you in a week's time. Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.